Ladies and gentlemen, from whenever you are following us, welcome to the Geneva Center for Security Policy. All of us here in Geneva are very pleased to have you join us virtually for today's webinar and the 2021 GCSP Innovation Prize Award ceremony. I'm GCSP Associate Fellow Dr. Paul Vallée, and it's my pleasure to accompany you for this program during 3 hours. This will first consist in an interactive webinar to which 3 distinguished experts will join us for a discussion on innovation and security, including a Q&A in which you will be most welcome to ask your questions to our panelists. Please note that during this discussion, our staff will be carrying out the prize draw to which you are all entered and which will allow you to win places at the 2022 Geopolitics and Global Futures Symposium. After a 15-minute break, we will resume at 1700 Central European Time with the award ceremony, followed again by an interview and Q&A with the top winners. Allow me now to hand you over to our director, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, to formally open these proceedings.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for participating in the GCSP Innovation Day. For the first time this year, this event organized by the Geopolitics and Global Futures program combines a webinar on security and innovation with the prize ceremony. Senior experts will talk to us about cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic weapon system. And then we will award the annual GCSP Prize for Innovation in Global Security. Many thanks to Professor Naif Al-Rodan and his great team for organizing this event. So why is it important to focus on innovation? Because it is essential to adapt in a rapidly changing world. In a way, we can say that innovation is part of Switzerland's DNA. Indeed, Switzerland has been ranked as the world's most innovative country for the 10th year in a row by the Global Innovation Index published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. This innovative Swiss spirit is also reflected in the way the GCSP operates. Indeed, innovation is part of its DNA since its creation in 1995. Our courses challenge our participants to think outside the box and find innovative solutions to complex security issues. Thanks to the GCSP way, our unique and inclusive approach. We like to consider all points of view. We seek to reconcile opposites, break down barriers, and encourage creativity and innovation in tackling international challenges. Our creative spark illustrates well this approach. How often do we lack the imagination to connect the dots, approach problems from a different perspective, and design innovative solutions? This is what we try to solve with our project incubator and accelerator. We support here at the GCSP experts and practitioners in making their innovative project a reality. Some of the ideas that the Creative Spark helped develop include GSERV, which was established to serve as the first global effort to support local community-level initiatives aimed at strengthening resilience against violent extremist agendas. Another example is the Climate Action Accelerator, a new non-profit initiative that left our incubator only a few weeks ago. It is an initiative launched to mobilize large-scale climate action by helping institutions in the health, education, and humanitarian sectors to cut their carbon emissions in half by 2030. A third example that incubated at the GCSP is Secure Access, a Geneva startup developing human safety solutions by leveraging new technologies and IoT. Dear colleagues, the event we are all gathered for today, the GCSP Prize for Innovation in Global Security, illustrates the GCSP's innovative state of mind. Launched in 2015 under the impulse of the Geopolitics and Global Futures program and its director, Professor Al Rodan, the prize seeks to reward the most inspiring, innovative, and groundbreaking contributions of the year, whether in the form of an initiative, an invention, a research publication, or an organization. Since its launch in 2015, we have had the honor to recognize 8 truly outstanding projects, including grassroots level cooperation projects, mobile applications, and international training and capacity building projects. I would want to invite you to stay with us until the end of this event to discover the winners of the 2021 edition of the prize, what fuels their inspiration, and learn how their innovations can help make the world a safer place. Thank you again for your participation, and I wish you all an innovative, an inspiring, and informative event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Greminger. I now invite Professor Nayef Al-Rodan, the head of the Geopolitics and Global Futures program and an honorary fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, for his own welcome remarks.
Thank you, Paul. My thanks to our distinguished director, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, for his leadership and support, to our GCSP colleagues and my dedicated program staff. As mentioned, our event today on innovations in security will be in 2 parts. The first will be a panel of 3 very distinguished speakers on cybersecurity and subversion, hypersonic missiles, and autonomous weapons. Secondly, our annual prize in innovation in global security. Let me just say a few words to frame the discussion for this afternoon and reflect our views of what global security is and isn't, both at GCSP and in my program's work. We think of global security as much more than successive national securities of states, although we recognize that states remain the most pivotal unitary actor in the global system. That is not in question and unlikely to be so in the foreseeable future. We also recognize that global security has 5 dimensions, something we did about a decade ago, that they're all interconnected and interdependent, namely national security, which remains the fulcrum, transnational security, human security, transcultural security, and environmental security, long before it was fashionable to talk about that. We also do not believe that in our instantly connected and interdependent world, that zero-sum paradigms work. I don't think they ever worked, but certainly in this day and age, they do not work. And we have instead suggested what we call multi-sum security, which states in a nutshell that for any state to be safe going forward, every other state has to feel safe. We also challenge IR paradigms going forward. We think classical or neoclassical and especially neoliberal IR theories are inadequate to account for the state of the modern world. And we believe that they do not provide the conceptual framework for sustainable solutions. They may work for segments of society, for segments of states. Instead, we have advocated previously what we have called symbiotic realism, and in which we advocate win-win solutions in a cooperative way, non-conflictual competition, and must allow for absolute gains. We also must account for what we call new game changers in the global security scene. And these include disruptive technologies like AI, cyber, machine learning, big data, synthetic biology, superintelligence, and climate challenges. We also have to account for what we call over-the-horizon frontier risks in global security. And these include future pandemics or other what we call biocatastrophes, climate consequences, major cyber meltdown of critical infrastructure, cascading outer space insecurity due to either overwhelming space debris, and this has been in the news this week, or critical militarization of space resulting in either intentional or accidental spacewalk. That sounds like sci-fi stuff, but it's not as far-fetched as you might think. So I'll end by some take-home messages based on the above. Is one, we think we should perfect old successful methodologies. Two, we should think outside the box. Three, we must prepare for frontier risks, and these include what we call gray rhinos and black swan events, and plan for sustainable symbiotic solutions that work for everyone, because the world is too connected and too interdependent to sustain narrow national geopolitical interests. I'll stop here. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Professor Al-Rodan, for these words of welcome. We'll move on with our program. So I'll now introduce the experts joining us for today's webinar on innovation and security, which Professor Al-Rodan will be moderating. So as he told you on the different themes we'll have today, on cybersecurity, we're joined by Dr. Lennart Maschmeyer, Senior Researcher at the Center for Security Studies, Zurich. Welcome, Dr. Maschmeyer. On the theme of hypersonic weapons program, we're also joined by Dr. Dominika Kunertova, also a Senior Researcher at the Center for Security Studies, Zurich. Welcome, Dr. Kunertova. And on the theme of autonomous weapons, we're joined by Dr. Neil Renic, a researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, Hamburg, Germany. Welcome to you as well, Dr. Renic. So our webinar begins with a 15 minutes analysis from each of these scholars and to be followed by the Q&A. So over to you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Paul. Our first speaker is an old friend of the program, Dr. Maschmeyer. He will talk to us for 15 minutes on cybersecurity, information technology, and subversion. By the way, parenthetically, for the audience, please prepare your questions. We will have plenty of time at the end at 1600 hours, and send them to the chat, and when the time comes, we'll ask you to personally ask questions. So now I'll give the floor to Dr. Maschmeyer.
Hi, thanks, Professor Al-Rodan, for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. I'm glad to give this talk. Let me just see that I share the right screen. So if this worked, you should now be seeing the slides. Yes? Perfect. All right, I don't have to introduce myself since you've already done that. Thank you. So the topic of the talk today basically comes out of my PhD dissertation, where I very much started looking into what Professor Al-Rodan just mentioned, the kind of future threats that we see with cybersecurity. But I did find by looking into it that actually what I found was very different than what I came into and expected in the beginning. Overall, the topic of cybersecurity concerns in this context the opportunities and the challenges that the spread of information technologies poses for actors in world politics, both to exert influence and to resist it. And the main point I'll be making is that cybersecurity is fundamentally about the subversion of information technology. And I'll focus on what this means for geopolitics. This talk is obviously a brief summary in 15 minutes, but it's based on an article I just published in International Security titled The Subversive Trilemma, which has much more detailed theory and also empirical evidence from Ukraine. So the starting point of this project was this kind of initial expectations work, expecting that information technology is going to revolutionize warfare. And the idea was that we go from something like this, conventional war, the Gulf War 1991, many see it as the kind of last great conventional war, to something like this, where conflict is no longer about mass and mobility, but rather the weaponization of information. And the expectation, or the reason why there was an expectation of a revolution, were supposed increases in operational effectiveness by leveraging and exploiting information technology in the speed of operations, the scale of effects, and at the same time, the ease of secrecy. And the strategic promise that resulted or was expected from this was this cheap and easy offense where you have low costs, low risks, but yet a potentially high payoff. And the predicted outcome would look something like this. Many of you have probably seen this if you've ever seen cybersecurity presentation, especially by private sector actors. It's known as a pew-pew map. And this would be basically escalation, because everyone is exploiting this offensive advantage that results from these increases in effectiveness. And that means everyone goes on the offense. And then you also see these tit-for-tat spirals as actors move towards greater intensity of conflict, maybe also conventional conflict. But this hasn't happened. It's been 30 years. There haven't been these cyber wars. We also haven't seen escalation of that kind. Actually, wargaming exercises show us the opposite. There is a kind of persistent reluctance to use cyber means because of a fear of escalation. And consequently, cyber conflict has actually been marked by persistently low intensity. And accordingly, there is more and more research now that's showing the limits of cyber operations as instruments of warfare. And that is because warfare requires force projection, but that seems to be precisely what cyber operations are relatively ineffective at. In response to that, now, currently at least, there is a new idea gaining hold that still expects a revolution, but in a different type of conflict, and that is conflict short of war. The idea, though, or interestingly, so we have this idea of revolution in a different type of conflict, but the underlying assumption of the causes are very similar to the first wave of scholarship, because again, the supposed causes increases in operational effectiveness. You have greater speed, greater scale, and greater secrecy are easier. It's easier to maintain secrecy compared to conventional means of projecting power short of war. And the expectation is that because of these increases, states can now shift the balance of power without going to war in ways that were not previously possible before you had this option. And so the outcome is you have a new form of conflict. Lucas Kello calls it unpeace. Ben Buchanan calls it a new form of statecraft that supposedly would revolutionize possibly international relations as a whole, right? If war is no longer the final arbiter of conflicts. But if that is so, the question I would pose to that is, where are the examples of this? So this is hypothetical, but there aren't really any cases where this is demonstrated in action. And I argue that the reason why we don't see these cases is that as the predecessor theory, this theory is mainly about the opportunities that are opened up by the new technology, but underestimating the challenges that are involved in fulfilling these opportunities in practice. And my argument is looking backwards in a way, challenging this notion that this is something entirely new, but instead looking at the parallels between cyber operations and other types of projecting power in conflict short of war. And here I saw this clear parallel to subversion, which is an understudied topic, but has been routinely used by states. Because it's, or as a starting point for this analysis, it's useful to look at what a cyber attack actually is. And generally that's seen as effects that are produced through a cyber operation, which are in turn commonly defined as different forms of state-sponsored hacking. Hacking in turn involves the exploitation of vulnerabilities. And that's also the parallel to subversion, as I explain in some more detail in a bit. There are two types of vulnerabilities that hackers can exploit. The first one are technical, which means design flaws in hardware and in the logic of software code. A key example here is the SolarWinds case, where Russian hackers found a vulnerability in an administration software that was popular, especially among US government employees. And by exploiting this vulnerability, gained access to the computers of these employees and had, a great intelligence win. But there are also social vulnerabilities, which mainly refer to pathologies in human psychology, and then also weaknesses in the security rules and practices around the use of technology. So the email you see here, it's a bit small, but I hope you can at least read a bit, is an example of a phishing email, one of the classic means of social exploitation, which was used to trick John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager in 2016, into revealing his email password, allowing the hackers then to subsequently steal all of his emails and publish them to great embarrassment. This reliance on exploitation, this is the main parallel to subversion as the underlying mechanism. So as I said, subversion hasn't really been studied much. That also means there isn't a lot of systematic theorizing on it, but a few distinguishing characteristics can be synthesized from that existing literature, mainly in intelligence studies. And the main point there is that subversion is an instrument in non-military covert operations. So it's a subset of covert operations. There are also covert operations that use force, secret wars, basically. Covert operations overall are intelligence operations that involve active interference in adversary affairs. And that way they're different from just passive collection of information, which is espionage. And subversion does this by exploiting vulnerabilities in systems. Traditionally, the types of systems targeted by subversion are social systems. And a common technique is using spies to infiltrate organizations in an adversary state and then establish influence within them. Classic example or infamous example are the KGB's illegal agents, which were widely deployed around the Western Alliance in the Cold War and went on this long-term deep penetration missions on undercover identities, often created over years and then also staying for years in the target countries, dramatized in the series The Americans, which is actually quite good if you're interested in this topic. Through this exploitation, you can create two types of outcomes. The first one, and that's the main one in most operations, is manipulating the system to produce outcomes that are not intended by its designers and participants and users, and obviously play towards the interest of the subverting party. And in doing so, using these systems against the adversary. But you can also undermine the system, which basically just means introducing some friction and making the system not work as well as possible. Some institutional sabotage would be a good way to frame that. So how is this linked to hackers? Obvious question. As I said, traditional subversion targets social systems. Cyber operations in turn target computer systems. It's a different type of target, but the mechanism of exploitation follows very much the same characteristics. And that's why I argue cyber operations are best understood as instruments of subversion, since they rely on this mechanism of exploitation rather than, say, force as in warfare. So by looking at subversion, we can draw some conclusions about cyber conflict. And the key thing about subversion is its strategic promise as an alternative to war, still gaining independent strategic value, weakening an adversary, fulfilling strategic goals. And in doing so, achieving similar results as in going to war in the ideal case, yet at lower costs and risks. So it gives you a way to interfere in your adversary's affairs without actually paying the price if you do it right. There are two reasons for this. The first one is that it's secret, and we do have already existing research showing that in covert warfare, you have the advantage of lowering the risk of reprisals and escalation by keeping it secret. And also you lower the reputational costs of violating the non-interference principle. Subversion also offers a third benefit compared though, because it produces effects indirectly through the systems of your adversary. That means the resource costs are even lower compared to warfare, where actors still have to deploy their own capabilities to generate force. So we have this great promise, which looks like a win-win scenario. But the problem is, and that is often overlooked, that there are significant challenges of fulfilling that promise and of successfully executing on this exploitation. The main reason for that is that secrecy and indirect action, they are not given characteristics, but they actually require significant efforts to attain and maintain them. And these efforts constrain effectiveness. So first of all, you have to identify vulnerabilities and develop means of exploitation in order to get in. This takes time, so that slows operational speed. Second, you need to learn how a target system functions and its layout, but you have to avoid detection because your opponent can neutralize the operation if they detect it. In traditional subversion, this is by arresting a spy in most cases. And third, the control that you have over these adversary systems is limited, not only because the victim can neutralize your control and your access if it's discovered, but also because usually you're not fully familiar with that system, so you don't have full control over it, only of parts of it. And then more importantly, when you manipulate a target to produce unexpected effects, this can work both ways. So the effects that are produced might be different than what you yourself expected. There might be no effect at all, or you might produce some unintended effects, and therefore also unintended consequences. And how this all comes together is that because of these challenges involved and the interactions between them, these three variables that I just mentioned, right, speed, intensity, and control, they're actually negatively correlated. So that means if you improve one, you tend to lose effectiveness in the remaining ones. And that produces a trilemma for subversive actors, which I'll briefly illustrate here based on the example of speed, but go into much more detail in the article, which is also titled the same. So for example, if you maximize speed in an operation, that means you have less time for reconnaissance and development. That also means you have less knowledge of the target system. So you're less likely to be able to produce intense effects. And you also tend to have less control over that system compared to spending more time. And the same conversely works for increasing intensity or control. Because of this trilemma, in practice, subversion tends to be too slow, too weak, and too volatile to fulfill its promise and produce actual strategic value when and where it's needed. The expectation then is now, going back to the start of the presentation, in the revolution that supposedly happens, that information technology alleviates some of these constraints. So one influential theorist is intelligence historian Michael Warner, who argues that now it's possible to run activities that are indistinguishable from covert action, but on a much larger scale. So we have this promise of technology, right? But I argue that actually because of the constraints involved and the parallels, cyber operations are subject to the same trilemma as traditional subversion and also have similarly limited value. If you think about it, it becomes quite obvious because in cyber operations, hackers still have to find vulnerabilities, develop means to exploit them. They also have to learn how target systems work and establish influence without being detected. Victims can delete malware or patch their systems, improve security practices, or just shut down the computer if possible, or disconnect it. There are different ways of neutralizing the influence, right? And hackers also have limited control over targeted systems for this very reason, that it can be neutralized, but also because they rarely have access to the whole system. So because of these constraints, we have the same trilemma. And that means in strategy, as traditional subversion, cyber operations do have this promise of winning without war in the ideal case, which is expected right now in prevailing theories. But important is we shouldn't confuse what's theoretically possible with what is practically feasible. And in practice, because of the trilemma, cyber operations tend to be also too slow, too weak, or too volatile to provide the strategic value. As a result, we don't have a revolution in conflict, but an evolution in subversion. And cyber operations are a new instrument to pursue strategies of subversion with their own distinct advantages and disadvantages, but there is no difference in kind that would create this revolution as many expect right now. They are likely to fail more often than succeed because of the operational constraints. And for the same reason, if they do succeed, they're likely to provide at best marginal shifts in the balance of power because of the limited intensity. And because of this, their impact on international politics is likely to be relatively limited compared to prevailing expectations. Thank you. I hope this was relatively clear. I look forward to your questions and discussing this in the Q&A session. And as I said, the article has much more detail on there. So if you're interested, check it out. Thanks.
Thank you, Lennart, for another brilliant talk. Very, very creative. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end. Now we move on to our next speaker, a new friend this time to the program, from Zurich, from CSS, Dominika Kunertova, who will talk to us about hypersonic missiles, weaponizing new technology. Dominika.
Thank you very much. First, let me share my screen. So I prepared the PowerPoint in case we have some audio disruptions. So full screen. Good. So thank you again for inviting me to GCSP Innovation Day. Hello from Zurich, and thank you for the kind introduction. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about hypersonic weapon systems because if you follow global security situation, like they've been gaining more and more media coverage, and they're presented as some new game-changing transformative warfighting capability. And the experts in security and engineers beg to disagree. So I believe I'm going to continue a bit with this meta-narrative that Lennart already introduced in his presentation about what is theoretically possible, and in practice we need to lower the expectations. So yeah, so in my presentation, I will go through the basic points in this debate. So first of all, what are these hypersonic weapon systems? What is their novelty, alleged novelty? What can they do? What they cannot do? Who are the key players, the key weaponizers, and the whole technology rivalry? And then I will conclude by reflecting on how disruptive these hypersonic weapons actually are. Let me first start with what we already have. What are the existing missile technology types? So first, cruise missiles. These are low-flying unmanned vehicles propelled by jet engine, and they are slower. They fly at like subsonic speed, but they are quite accurate. And then the second main type, ballistic missiles. They are boosted by rockets very high into the beyond atmosphere, and then they fall down along predictable trajectory like a bullet. So by detecting the parameters at the launch, you can actually tell what is the impact area of this missile. So based on this, we can probably like identify the novelty of what the hypersonic missiles are about. Like they combine the two main advantages of the existing missiles, the speed and accuracy. The first main type of hypersonic weapon system is the glider, which is an unpropelled vehicle. First is boosted by a rocket technology in atmosphere up to 100 kilometers, and then it glides down unpropelled towards its target. And it's maneuverable, it can evade missile defenses. And then hypersonic cruise missiles are basically a faster version of existing cruise missiles, but they are using this specific supersonic combustion ramjet engines, which should propel them to the high speed. So looking at these characteristics, the hypersonic weapon system are not only distinguishable by their high speed, so that they can fly at the maintained speed of more than Mach 5, so 5 times the speed of sound, which is like more than 6,000 kilometers per hour, but also they are maneuverable, and this can create this element of surprise when it comes to the defenders, for instance, reaction time, the target ambiguity, and they also, thanks to the altitude at which they fly, it can be very difficult to detect them. I also put in the bracket the other vehicles that can fly at hypersonic speeds. They are like demonstrators, and then classic space shuttles. They can also fly at hypersonic speed. But also, I would put like a little footnote: existing ballistic missiles also fly at hypersonic speeds, like the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, more than like Mach 23 at certain points. So again, the speed is not the only distinguishing factor, characteristics of these weapon systems. Clearly, this hypersonic technology is very difficult to master and requires a lot of time and resources, which means that it's something very prestigious to master, which means that it's the realm of great powers like Russia, China, and the United States are the main weaponizers of hypersonic technology for different sorts of reasons, but most of all, it's about the status. Like if you can master hypersonic missiles, you deserve the status of great power, national prestige. You can intimidate foreign audiences. However, for Russia and China, they also have a genuine geostrategic concerns. In case of Russia, that goes back to the termination of anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. So for Russia, the reasoning goes that they need to create a qualitatively new way of overcoming American missile defenses. In case of China, this is more about projecting Chinese superiority in the Asia-Pacific region, limiting room for maneuver for the US in terms of all the dynamic around Taiwan, and also protecting their second strike capabilities in case of some preemptive US attack. And then when it comes to the US, well, even though the United States have been investing a lot in hypersonic technology for the past decades, they found themselves behind Russia and China, because until recently they didn't feel the need to kind of actually deploy these systems. So in terms of the United States, it's more about catching up with Russia and China and playing this action-reaction game. I also mentioned that other countries are interested in military application of hypersonic technology, and they've hypersonic programs in Australia, France, also in Asia Pacific, like Japan, India, South Korea. There were some rumors that also North Korea tested hypersonic missile, but that was dismissed by the area experts. So it's a lot of hype going on about military use of these fast-flying vehicles. There have been also some speculations about using hypersonic propulsion for civilian aviation, but this is also, we need to look at it with a little bit of skepticism, because anything that flies more than the speed of sound creates a supersonic boom, and these flights are noisy, and of course they are forbidden overpopulated areas. So yeah, a little bit more here. I have listed all the existing programs in the United States, Russia, and China, because these are the main players in the field of militarizing hypersonic technology. There are programs in all types, the gliders and cruise missiles. And as you can see, the United States is only about to launch a proper weapon procurement program in 2023. Up until now, it's only about research, development, and testing prototypes. When you look at the situation in Russia and China, this is only according to open source information, which is really littered by Chinese and Russian propaganda. So sometimes we are not really certain about the operational status of the systems, but both are claiming they have already some gliders operational since 2019. And of course, I have to address the latest news, which is the latest innovation. As you might have heard, over summer, China tested something completely new that spooked the US military authorities. And it was first reported by Financial Times in October that China tested some nuclear-capable hypersonic missile that circled around the globe before speeding towards the target. So I would just say, like, first of all, the nuclear-capable hypersonic missile is already existing in ICBM. So that was kind of like, okay, what's new about that? According to what we know, China is the first country that combined two systems, the orbital weapons and glider technology. Orbital weapons, that's something that could have been inspired by the Soviet fractional orbital bombardment system, which in the test of the Chinese test also carried this glider to provide like local maneuverability. And when you look at the graphic that was prepared by The Economist, this is yet again like a hint towards the thinking of Chinese planners, defense planners, that this provides yet another way of evading American static missile defenses by flying through the South Pole, where you don't have any early warning radars. There's no SORAD in terms of NORAD, right? So this is basically the situation when, again, United States was kind of surprised at the the extent at which the Chinese hypersonic weapon programs are advanced. But also the report said that the missile missed the target by 40 kilometers. So it's, this is what we know about the latest type of hypersonic system. Now let me just say a few words, and then why is this hype like justified? How worried should we be, right? So as I said, like the main advantages of these hypersonic weapon systems comes with this high speed and maneuverability that introduces the element of surprise, with the shortening the time of the observe, orient, and decide act loop, right? That the defender doesn't know which target the missile, the warhead is going to hit, and then the increased accuracy. However, by reading reports by people very that have been like looking in the hypersonic technology for years, and engineers testing, doing some modulations, right? So they point to the fact that there are physical limitations that needs to be taken into account while presenting these missiles as something as a game changer. Because, for instance, anything that flies above Mach 1 can be highly maneuverable, and there always have to be some trade-offs between how much the glider glides, right, and like the more the vehicle glides, the lower the speed is. So there's the trade-off, and then the other main point is the physical limitation of flying low in the atmosphere. Because at the temperature, the surface temperature of the vehicle that is flying at a high speed like Mach 5 is heated to really extreme temperatures, more than 1000 degrees Celsius, and this creates some disruption. When it comes to detection, the high temperature creates some ionized gas that can disrupt the navigation signals of the missile, and then also, it creates a plasma around the vehicle, which means that the plasma itself is visible on the radars, so the missile is detectable. And then flying in low atmosphere, that's also a very demanding of fuel, so it does need to be incorporated into design. And like the scramjets, for instance, they fly. Or they can start function only when the vehicle is moving at Mach 3 or more. So these are all technical details, technical assessments, which like sends this cautionary message that hypersonic weapons are not revolutionary but evolutionary, because it's about just higher speed, more different range, different altitude, but they are not revolutionary in itself. First of all, because they don't add that much value to existing capabilities based on missile technology that we have at the moment, at the strategic ranges especially, because both China and Russia already have ICBMs that can reach American continent. According to the tests, the hypersonic gliders are even slower than ICBMs when they fly at this range. So my conclusion of this debate is that probably military officials are exaggerating the advantages of these systems to get more funding, so that they can brag about new shiny weapons, right? Which at the end of the day don't have that much added value in terms of military effectiveness. And that the real danger about these hypersonic weapon systems is about how they distort the threat perception, how they create this sense of urgency on both sides, creating the action-reaction problem. Probably they can inspire new arms race, and at the end, yes, they are dangerous. They are, in case of these three states, they are both nuclear armed states. And hypersonic gliders and missiles are just yet another new delivery vehicles to that can be equipped with nuclear warheads. So yeah, it creates sense of mistrust, lack of transparency, and that increases the risk of misperception and overreactions. And believe that also UN Office for Disarmament already called for these countries to start talking about how they can increase transparency in these weapons programs. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominika, for a very interesting talk. Now we go to our third and final talk by another old friend of the program, Neil Renic, is going to talk to us about autonomous weapons, moral, legal, and regulatory challenges. Welcome back, Neil.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and even more for the invitation. I only have 15 minutes like everyone else, so this focus is going to be unavoidably narrow and PowerPoint free. Just try something new. I'll talk briefly about the legal and moral challenges of autonomous violence and then offer some thoughts on the regulatory debate surrounding this technology. But obviously anything I miss, I'm happy to talk about and pick back up in the Q&A. So as I said, I'm here to talk about autonomous weapons, systems that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. This technology concerns many people for many reasons, including those that relate to the strategic, political, and technical realm, escalatory reasons as well. But my focus here is on law and morality only. So first up, the law. What are the legal challenges of autonomous violence? And I think it's best to consider these challenges from two different but related angles. The first question we have to ask is, can we develop autonomous weapon systems with the technical proficiency to match and ideally exceed human combatants in relation to battlefield compliance, rule compliance? Can we develop weapon systems that can be proportionate, that can be discriminate, weapon systems that can tell the difference between a combatant and a non-combatant and recognize the moment the former transitions into the latter and the latter back into the former? Can we develop machines good enough to do this in all or at least some battlefield scenarios? And if only some, then which? Can we create sufficient guardrails limiting where and how these machines operate? And many obviously have doubts. But on top of this, we have to ask ourselves another more fundamental question, which is these rules we've created to regulate war, how codable, how programmable are they? Are they so subjective as to limit machine interpretation? In war, particularly contemporary urban-centric warfare, the enemy will often be without uniform, or the fact that they're armed will be insufficient evidence that they are the enemy. Judgment is needed here, obviously. And can we receive that and expect that from a machine or an algorithm? And then obviously, what about sparing life? Evaluating the precise moment a combatant is legally entitled to mercy is no easy feat, sometimes more art than science. For many, distinguishing human beings as combatants or non-combatants is a hard limit on this technology. These categories are simply too nebulous for machines to effectively automate. Recognition might be possible for big pieces of military hardware, and in this regard, autonomous weapons may eventually outperform us. But tracking down and killing humans, which is in fact what many of these machines are hyped to be able to do, is simply too fraught, or so the argument goes. And for the record, this is an argument I'm quite sympathetic to. On top of this, we obviously have to think about accountability. If the employment of these machines leads to a tragic accident or gross negligence or something resembling a war crime, then who pays? It can be difficult to ascertain legal culpability in some of these cases, when the very point is to remove the human from the equation to some degree. So moving on to morality, an aspect of war that is too often sidelined in these discussions. Arguments are made that we should prohibit the development and use of autonomous weapons in war because there's something fundamentally wrong morally with using machines to hunt down and kill human beings. And this argument appeals to the almost biological discomfort many have with this image of machine killing. Reference is often made here to the Martens Clause of the first additional protocol to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. According to this clause, New means and methods of war must comply with the principles of humanity and the dictates of the public conscience. Autonomous weapons violate the Martens Clause, some argue, by virtue of the inherent indecency of this type of violence. Alongside this worry are concerns about what autonomous warfare is likely to incentivize, and specifically its potential to contribute to a further dehumanization of the battlefield. The first thing we need to recognize here is that long before the invention of autonomous weapons, we humans have shown ourselves to be perfectly capable of dehumanizing each other. Within war, we've seen this episodically, particular junctures in battle where moral connection with the enemy disappears, where their inherent worth is no longer recognized, and essential restraints on the use of force collapse. And we've also seen this manifest more systematically. Some of the worst episodes of human history feature institutional and endemic dehumanization, colonial violence, ethnic cleansing, genocide. These are human afflictions done by humans, directed against humans. Recognition of this historical context, however, shouldn't blind us to the dangers of autonomous weapons. They should, in fact, make us more sensitive to them. The concern I have with systematic killing, including the systematic killing delivered through autonomous weapons, is that it will erode these very fragile bonds of humanity between adversaries, bonds that have historically served as an important, but by no means foolproof, safeguard on restraint. Systematic autonomous violence has the potential to degrade the status of both the recipients and the dispensers of violence. The recipients, by rendering them down into mere data points of a problematized category, no longer human adversaries to be fought and overcome, but rather inconvenient obstacles to be done away with. And systematic autonomous violence might also jeopardize the status of the dispensers of violence. So in order to prevent war from descending into the worst possible version of itself, we want fighters who are capable of both self-reflection and meaningful and sustained moral judgment. I regard these as essential qualities. Combatants must remain inclined and, just as importantly, be afforded the chance to render judgment of their war, their side, themselves, and their conduct. And when violence and killing becomes too systematic, too autonomized, the capacity to self-reflect can weaken or disappear entirely. Responsibility dilutes in such circumstances. Combatants are less able to correct or even recognize morally problematic action. And this is one of the more serious fears I and others have in relation to autonomous weapons, that the shift to these technologies will leave us with something we shouldn't want: sanitized, systematic violence, temporally compressed, with little to no space in it for meaningful human reflection. And this is a problem I don't think can be addressed by simply guaranteeing that humans remain on the loop, as it's sometimes put. I think we need to reflect seriously on the type of battlefield conditions conducive to and hostile to the rules and standards we want to preserve, and whether or not autonomous weapons can align with our moral expectations of war. So in the time I have left, I'm going to very briefly discuss the state of the regulatory debate, a debate I would describe as quite, but not entirely, depressing from the perspective of those in favor of a preemptive ban on this technology. The international debate over autonomous weapons has taken place primarily within the framework of the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW, and the CCW operates on a consensus basis, meaning that all decisions must have the universal support of member states. In the case of autonomous weapons, this format has impeded progress, granting states such as the United States and Russia effective veto power over the formal negotiation of a ban treaty. Alongside these format institutional limits, there are other regulatory challenges that relate to both the timing of these efforts and the nature of the technology itself. I would regard these as challenges of uncertainty: technical uncertainty, normative uncertainty, and instrumental uncertainty. First, technical uncertainty. What do I mean by this? Basically, that there is quite significant, long-standing, and enduring disagreement over how exactly we should define autonomous weapons. And this matters because how exactly we define this technology might determine whether or not it should be banned or merely regulated, or whether or not it even exists currently. In debate over the status of autonomous weapons at the United Nations, some states have argued that a preemptive ban on this technology is a mistake, precisely because we don't yet have definitional consensus. And the concern is that without this consensus, any regulation created is likely to be under or over-inclusive, meaning that it'll prohibit too much or too little, or too little or too much. Now, to be clear, I think in many of these cases, arguments against regulation on the grounds of a lack of definitional consensus have been either overblown or quite cynically deployed. And there have been some strong and very coherent proposals put forward to regulate this technology on the basis of acceptable and unacceptable effects. So kind of more ends-focused approach. And the anticipation is that proposals like this would be better able to endure the vagaries of technological evolution. But what is certainly clear is that technical uncertainty and definitional ambiguity has been cited consistently as a reason for delaying a legal prohibition on autonomous weapons. And alongside technical uncertainty, we have some normative uncertainty. I've already listed some of the major legal and moral concerns people have with this technology, but we have to recognize that others disagree. Where some see dangers, others see opportunities, a potential to mitigate and possibly transcend some of the ethical problems of the battlefield. The United States in particular has been quite vocal in its suggestion that this technology might actually enhance rule compliance on the battlefield, enabling a more precise and proportionate application of violence. Some have gone as far as to say there's a moral imperative to develop autonomous weapons. So why an imperative? Advocates argue that while autonomous weapons will not be able to eliminate the fog of war, referring to the uncertainty and situational awareness experienced by participants in a military operation, they may be able to reduce it to an unprecedented degree. They'll be able to better observe the battlefield and make more deliberative, less error-prone decisions, free of human frailties, free of self-preservation. They'll be able to better comply with the rules of the battlefield. And reference is often made here to the history of war and the less than glorious record of emotional, fallible human beings in this regard. Perhaps a shift to systems of violence that are less emotional will be an improvement. At least that's the pitch made by some techno-optimists. And remember, we're dealing with a technology that remains speculative in many ways. Fully autonomous violence is getting far closer to a military reality, but it isn't here yet. And this creates a more ambiguous space, a space where both techno-pessimism and techno-optimism can find purchase. A final regulatory challenge relates to instrumental uncertainty. And here I'm referring to military utility. We don't yet know with precision exactly how well this technology will perform in battle, whether it's, a marginal change in the sort of long line of technological changes or whether it's a game changer. But the anticipation regarding its potential, and specifically the anticipation of great powers, is an obvious challenge for would-be regulators. Much of the promise of lethal autonomous weapons lies in their potential to operate at a tempo faster than humans can replicate, to gather, process, and respond to information at rates that far exceed those of humans. And it's not difficult to understand why this upgrade of speed is so sought after. If you can identify what needs doing on the battlefield and execute it while your enemy is still processing what's going on around them, you have a fairly significant advantage in war. In discussions over whether or not to preemptively ban autonomous weapons, major powers, including the US, the UK, and Russia, have made clear their unwillingness to prematurely abandon a technology that can potentially convey such a significant battlefield advantage. So that's a very abbreviated overview of the moral, legal, and regulatory challenges of autonomous weapons. There are many other challenges to regulation. I've sort of focused mostly on the political roadblocks. There's obviously challenges related to verification, enforcement, the potential for cheating, the fact that these are systems rather than discrete technologies, but I can't really go into that. Just very quickly before I go, where does all this leave us in November of 2021? because we're a month away from the CCW review conference. And there's a growing sense among some activists that all the value that can be drawn from the CCW process has been drawn from the CCW process. And perhaps it's time to move on to an alternative forum. And I think this would be a similar process to what we saw with the anti-personnel landmine treaty, which was initially debated within the CCW, but then came into being outside the CCW. If certain states continue to stand in the way of a formal negotiation of some form of legal measure against autonomous weapons, then I wouldn't be surprised if the CCW process does come to an end. If not at the end of this year, then at some point in the near term. And the question will then be, was the CCW process a failure? I don't necessarily see it as such. If we accept the basic limits of the CCW process, including its unanimity as consensus format, and downgrade our expectations accordingly, then I think value in it can be found. Its value as an incubator rather than a midwife of either regulation or a prohibition. A years-long debate over this technology has created a normative and legal template, one that has helped clarify expectations and concerns regarding autonomous violence, and even more importantly, one that can be developed further in the years ahead. And that's nowhere close to what campaigners want, but it's not nothing. So that's my pessimistically optimistic take on the regulatory debate. I'll leave it there. Obviously happy to answer any questions or address any comments you have in the Q&A.